Silas Crow didn't knock. That was the first thing Eleanor Voss noticed. Not the creak of her front door swinging open without warning, not the heavy bootsteps crossing her kitchen floor like the man already owned it, but the simple fact that he hadn't bothered to knock. A woman's home, and he walked in like he was checking on livestock. She was standing at the stove when he entered, her back to him, stirring a pot of beans that were mostly water. Clara was at the table behind her, 8 years old and already too good at reading a room, already folding herself small the way children do when they sense something dangerous has walked in wearing a man's shape. Crow set a piece of paper on the table without a word. He let it sit there. He pulled out the chair across from Clara, not asking, not hesitating, and lowered himself into it like a man settling in for a long evening. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I think we both know why I'm here." Eleanor turned from the stove. She kept her expression flat because she had learned in the 14 months since Thomas died that showing anything to certain men was the same as handing them a weapon. "You could have sent notice," she said. "I did." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere above his mouth. 3 times. The paper on the table was stamped in red ink. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. She had been reading versions of that paper in her sleep for 6 months. The debt figure, the accrued interest, the signature at the bottom that Thomas had put there when he was still alive and still believed a man's word meant something. Crow folded his hands on the table. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of authority that comes not from strength, but from never having been told no in so long that he'd forgotten the word existed. "The balance as of this morning," he said, "is $412. The note matures in 11 days. Eleanor didn't move. "I have $38, she said. It came out steadier than she felt. "And 20 cents. Crow looked at her the way a man looks at a clock that's already stopped. Patient. Finished with the conversation before it had properly begun. "Then we have a problem." Clara hadn't moved from her chair. She was watching Crow with eyes that were too old for her face, the beans going cold in her bowl, her spoon balanced across the rim, like she'd set it down carefully and on purpose. If you've ever had someone walk into your home and make you feel like a stranger in it, you already know what Eleanor felt in that moment. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Voss Ranch sat 11 miles east of Red Hollow, on land that Thomas had broken with his own hands over the course of 7 years. He'd come out from Ohio in the spring of 1874 with $30, a mule, and the particular kind of stubbornness that either makes a man or ruins him, depending on the weather. Eleanor had followed him 6 months later, newly married and already suspecting she'd attached herself to someone who felt more at home with difficult things than easy ones. She hadn't been wrong. Thomas was not an easy man. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet. Not peaceful, just turned inward, running calculations she was never invited to see. He worked from before dawn until after dark, and he expected the same from the land and the cattle and, without ever saying it plainly, from Eleanor. She'd given it, 12 years of it, and the land had responded the way good land does when someone refuses to quit on it, slowly, stubbornly, then suddenly and completely. By 1880, they had 400 acres under their name, 160 head of cattle, a proper house with glass windows, and Clara, who arrived that spring like a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. Then the drought started. Not all at once. Droughts never do. First just a dry spring, which anyone could absorb. Then a drier summer, which required some adjustment. Then a third year of it, and a fourth. And by then the cattle were thinning and the well was dropping and the adjustments had run out. Thomas took the loan from Crow's Bank in the fall of 1882. $400 at an interest rate that seemed workable when the rains were going to return any month now. Surely any month. Thomas died in February of 1883. His heart, the doctor said, though Eleanor had always suspected it was something less specific than that. More like a man who'd spent everything he had on a bet that didn't pay and had nothing left to operate on. She buried him on a Thursday. She was back working the ranch on Friday because there was no alternative. The loan didn't care that she was a widow. The interest didn't pause for grief. And Silas Crow, who had sat in a pew 3 rows behind her at Thomas's funeral, head bowed at exactly the right angles, had sent the first notice of default 6 weeks later. That had been 14 months ago. Since then, Eleanor had sold 2 horses, the plow rig, 40 head of cattle she couldn't afford to lose, her mother's silver-handled hairbrush set, and Thomas's pocket watch. She'd taken in 2 boarders over the winter, men who worked at the mill and needed somewhere to sleep. She'd stretched every dollar until it was thin enough to read through, and she was still $250 short of where she needed to be when the year turned, and now, somehow, $62 short of $412. With 11 days left on a note that had been designed, she was beginning to understand this in her bones, if not yet in her head, to be unpayable. After Crow left, Clara came to stand beside Eleanor at the window. They watched his horse move back down the road toward town, unhurried, the way things move when they know they've already won. "Is he going to take the ranch?" Clara asked. Eleanor put her hand on top of Clara's head. The girl's hair needed cutting. She'd been meaning to do it for 3 weeks. "Not while I'm standing," Eleanor said. It wasn't a plan. It was barely even a promise. But Clara nodded like it was both, and that had to be enough for now. Eleanor went to the tin box under the floorboard beneath the kitchen table, the one Thomas had put there because he didn't entirely trust banks, which turned out to be more foresight than eccentricity. She lifted the lid and counted again even though she already knew. $38.20. 3 tens, a 5, 3 ones, and a scatter of coins that she'd organized and reorganized so many times the edges felt warm. She put the money back. She sat at the table in the chair Crow had pulled out and hadn't pushed back in. She thought about what she knew. She knew the land. She knew every fence post and water crossing on it. She knew which sections held moisture longest and which went to dust first. She knew where the cattle liked to drift when the wind came from the north. She knew the sound the windmill made when it needed greasing and the sound it made when it was about to fail completely, and she knew those were different sounds. What she didn't know, had never needed to know because Thomas had handled it, was contracts. Paper. The machinery of debt and interest and default. She'd signed things she hadn't fully understood when Thomas had been alive, because he'd been there to explain them or to tell her not to worry, and she'd trusted him, and now that trust was a liability. The contract with Crow's bank was in a cedar box in the bedroom. She'd read it 4 times since Thomas died. Each time she'd come away with a different level of dread, depending on which section she lingered over. There were clauses in it she didn't understand. There were references to other documents she'd never seen. There was language about collateral that seemed to extend further than just the land. She got up and retrieved it. She sat back down and read it again, 5th time, in the thin late afternoon light coming through the east window. She read it slowly, the way you read something when you know the answer is in there somewhere but keeps hiding from you. She was on the 3rd page when she found something she hadn't noticed before, or had noticed and not understood the weight of. A clause, written in smaller print than the surrounding text, that used the phrase "and all related property and dependents therein" in a context that she read twice, then a 3rd time, her finger tracing the words. Dependents therein. She set the paper down. Clara was outside now. Eleanor could hear her through the open window, talking to the old roan horse in the paddock the way she always did. A one-sided conversation about whatever had interested her that day. The horse's name was Chester, and he was 19 years old and too slow for working cattle, and too old to sell for anything worth having, and Clara loved him with the particular totality that children reserve for animals that are gentle and useless and entirely without agenda. Dependence therein. Eleanor picked the paper back up and read the clause again. It said, if she was reading it correctly, if the language meant what she thought it meant in plain terms, that in the event of default, the bank held rights not only to the listed property, but to any dependent persons residing on the property without independent financial means. She put the contract flat on the table and pressed both hands on it like she was trying to keep it from moving. This wasn't a loan. She understood that now with a clarity that felt physical, like something shifting in her chest. This was a trap. Thomas had walked them into a trap, probably without knowing it, because he'd been desperate, and the man across the desk from him had been smiling. Odd. She went into Red Hollow the next morning. She left Clara with the horses and the instruction to stay inside if anyone came up the road, which Clara accepted with the seriousness of a soldier receiving orders she understood better than she was supposed to. Red Hollow had a main street that was 3 blocks long, and ambitions that had stopped expanding sometime around 1879. There was a general store, a feed supplier, 2 saloons, a post office, a doctor's office that doubled as a barber shop, and the Red Hollow Savings and Lending, which was Silas Crow's operation in name and in every practical fact, though the name above the door said something else. There was also, at the far end of the second block, a law office. The sign read A. Pritchard, Esquire, Legal Consultations and Land Affairs. Eleanor had walked past it dozens of times. She had never had occasion to go inside. She had occasion now. She pushed open the door. The man inside was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. He was perhaps 60, slight, with the look of someone who had been thin his entire life and had stopped being bothered by it decades ago. He was sitting behind a desk covered in paper, organized into a system that made sense only to him, reading something through spectacles perched at the very end of his nose. He looked up when she entered. "Mrs. Voss," he said. She stopped. "You know me?" "I know most people in a town this size." He set his papers down. "Sit down, please." She sat in the chair across from his desk and put the contract on the surface between them. She told him about the clause. She told him about Crow's visit, the figure, the 11 days. She told him about the phrase dependence therein and what she thought it meant, watching his face while she talked. His expression didn't change much while she spoke. He nodded in a few places. He picked up the contract when she'd finished and read for a while in silence, turning pages with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to distrust speed. "Where did your husband negotiate this loan?" he asked, without looking up. "At the bank." "At Crow's bank." "Was anyone else present?" "The bank manager, a man named Fulton." "Anyone else? A witness of any kind?" "Not that I know of." Pritchard set the contract down and removed his spectacles and set them on top of it. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I want to be honest with you about 2 things. The first is that this contract contains language I've seen in other instruments that Crow's Bank has issued over the past several years, and it has a particular character to it that I would describe as predatory is the accurate word. The clauses are written to appear straightforward and become complicated only when default occurs, at which point the borrower typically does not have the means to contest them properly." Eleanor nodded. That confirmed what she'd already felt. "The second thing," Pritchard said, and here he paused in a way that made her grip the edge of the chair, "is that I have tried twice before to challenge Crow's contracts in this jurisdiction, and I have lost both times. The circuit judge who handles Red Hollow's cases is a man named Hooper. I will leave you to draw your own conclusions about the relationship between Judge Hooper and Silas Crow." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was unloading something from a wagon. She could hear the scrape and thump of it. "So there's nothing to be done," Eleanor said. "I didn't say that." Pritchard stood up and moved to the cabinet behind him. He extracted a folder, thin, and set it on top of her contract. "I said I lost both times. What I did not say is that losing those cases taught me nothing. There are grounds here, specifically around the mental and physical condition of the signatory at the time of signing, that could be viable if you have any documentation of your husband's health in the period preceding his signature." She thought about that. Thomas had been sick in the fall of 1882. She remembered it clearly. He'd been feverish for 2 weeks in October, bad enough that she'd called the doctor. Bad enough that he'd stayed in bed 3 days in a row, which was something he would never have done otherwise. She remembered the date because she'd had to manage the cattle alone that week, and she'd lost 2 head to a gully she hadn't known was soft. "There was a doctor," she said. "Dr. Hale. He came to the house in October of '82. Pritchard looked at her steadily. "Dr. Hale is still practicing," he said. 3 doors down." Dr. Franklin Hale was a careful man. Eleanor had always sensed that about him in the few times she'd had cause to see him. The way he weighed his words, the way he wrote things down before saying them out loud. The particular unhurried quality of his attention that made you feel seen and also slightly pinned in place. He was 54 years old. He had been practicing in Red Hollow since 1871. He kept records of every visit, every examination, every conversation of medical significance in a series of ledgers that he stored in a locked cabinet behind his examination table, and he took that storage very seriously. Eleanor explained what she needed. Hale listened without interrupting. He unlocked the cabinet, found the ledger for 1882, and turned to October. He read for a while. Then he looked up. "Your husband came to me on October the 14th, he said. Or rather, I came to him. You'd sent for me. I examined him that evening. He had a significant fever, 103 degrees by my thermometer. There was also, and I documented this, a level of confusion, what I noted at the time as mental clouding associated with elevated temperature. He was not fully lucid." Eleanor sat very still. "The loan was signed October 19th, she said. Hale closed the ledger. He didn't put it away. "I see," he said quietly. "Would you testify to what you documented?" she asked. "In a hearing, if it came to that." The question hung between them. She watched something move through his expression. Not reluctance exactly, more like a man calculating a distance and not being entirely sure he had what it took to cross it. Everyone in Red Hollow knew what crossing Silas Crow cost. It cost plenty. That was the whole machinery of it. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I've sat on what I know about certain things in this town for a long time." He ran a hand over his face. "Too long, perhaps. Documenting the truth and then filing it in a locked cabinet is—" He stopped. He tried again. "It stops being medical practice and starts being something else, something less honorable, when you know what the document could do and you leave it locked anyway." He set the ledger on his desk beside the lamp. "I would testify," he said, "if it came to that." Eleanor walked back to Pritchard's office with the information. She gave Pritchard what Hale had told her, including the date discrepancy. She watched him write it down in his neat, deliberate hand. "It's not nothing," he said when she'd finished. "It's actually quite significant if we can get in front of the right judge." "The problem is Judge Hooper," Eleanor said. "Is Judge Hooper," he confirmed. "This would need to go to the circuit court, which means we need a reason to escalate above the local jurisdiction. That's harder to manufacture than it sounds." Eleanor looked at the contract on his desk. She thought about the phrase dependence therein. She thought about Clara at the paddock fence, talking to an old roan horse about nothing important. "Then we'll find a reason," she said. She wasn't sure she believed it yet, but she said it like she did, which was sometimes how believing started. Quote, "She was riding back out of town, the afternoon heat pressing down on everything, the road empty and white with dust, when she noticed the horse. It was tied outside the second saloon, a dark bay with a traveling saddle, saddlebags that were full and had been full a while. The particular look of a horse that covered distance for a living rather than standing in one place. There was nothing remarkable about it except the way she noticed it, some instinct she couldn't account for, and then immediately told herself to stop being fanciful. She kept riding. She was a quarter-mile out of town when she heard boots on the road behind her, and a voice that was not asking her to stop. Not commanding, not demanding, just talking in a way that assumed she'd hear it and make her own choice. "That was Crow's man who came out of the lawyer's office after you did," the voice said. She pulled the horse up and turned around. The man standing in the road was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the specific way of someone who didn't eat regularly, rather than someone who watched what he ate. He had a few days of stubble and the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen a lot of landscape and weren't particularly moved by it anymore. He was holding his hat, not wearing it, and there was something in the gesture that made him seem less threatening than he might have otherwise. "I don't know you," Eleanor said. "No, ma'am. My name is Caleb Mercer. I've been in town about 2 days." He put his hat back on. "I wasn't following you. I was heading this direction anyway, but I thought you should know about Crow's man." "Who is Crow's man?" "Fella in a brown jacket. He went in right after you came out of that office, stayed about 15 minutes. I don't know what was said in there, but I can make a reasonable guess." She studied him. "Why does it concern you?" He looked down the road for a moment. He had the look of a man composing something, deciding how much of a thing to tell. and in what order. It doesn't concern me, he said finally. That's sort of the problem. She waited. I came through a town 2 years ago, he said. Smaller than this one. Family named Garrett, husband, wife, 4 kids, had a situation similar to yours. Different man, same kind of contract. I knew what was happening. I minded my own business. I moved on. He paused. I found out later they lost everything, ended up splitting the kids up between different relations because the wife couldn't support them alone. Eleanor kept her eyes on him. What do you want? She asked. Nothing, he said. I don't want anything from you. I'm saying, if there's something I can do. I know some people. I've been through a lot of jurisdictions. I've run into Crow's name before, in other counties, other towns. The man has a history that he's worked hard to keep in separate piles, but some of those piles have edges that poke up if you know where to look. It was the most she'd ever heard from a stranger in a single stretch. It was also, underneath the length of it, a fairly plain offer. She should have said no. She knew that even then. She'd spent 14 months building something solid and singular out of the ruins of Thomas's death, and it was built out of her own materials, her own judgment, her own refusal to let anyone else hold the load. That was the structure she'd constructed, and she trusted it because she'd tested it. And the one thing you didn't do with the structure you'd tested was let a stranger start adjusting the walls. But she thought about Crow's man walking into Pritchard's office right after she'd walked out. She thought about dependence therein. Come out to the ranch, she said. It felt like stepping onto ice she hadn't tested. We can talk more there. He nodded once. No expression of gratitude, no reassurance, no attempt to make her feel better about what was already a complicated decision. Just a nod, practical and plain. She turned back to the road and kept riding. He followed at a distance that felt deliberately chosen, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. She didn't look back, but she was aware of him the whole way. Clara was at the paddock fence when Eleanor came in. Chester, the roan, had his head hanging over the rail, and Clara had both arms as far over the fence as she could reach, scratching the space between his ears. She looked up when Eleanor rode in, then passed Eleanor at the man coming up the road. "Who's that?" she called. "Someone who says he can help," Eleanor said. Clara watched Caleb come up the road with the measured assessment of a child who has been left alone with responsibility too often, and learned from it. "Is he going to?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet." Caleb came through the gate. He glanced at Clara, then at Chester. "Fine old horse," he said. "He's too old to work," Clara said, "but he's still good." "Those aren't always different things," Caleb said, which was the right answer, and Eleanor noticed that Clara's posture shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, but the lowering of some watchfulness. She put Caleb's horse in the far paddock and came back to find him at the porch steps, not having sat down or gone inside, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that the house was not his to enter until invited. She made coffee. They sat at the table, the same table Crow had sat at yesterday, which Eleanor was aware of in a way that felt almost superstitious. She set the contract in front of Caleb and let him read it. He read carefully. He read the way Pritchard had read, slowly, without rushing toward conclusion. He found the clause almost immediately, without her pointing to it, which told her he'd seen this kind of language before. He looked up. "The dependents therein clause?" he said. "Yes." "That's not standard language in a land note." "No," she said. "I know." He set the contract down. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his head. "I've seen this in 2 other jurisdictions," he said. "Both times Crow, or men like Crow, used it not to actually take the children, but as leverage, a threat. Something to make the debtor give up the land voluntarily rather than contest the seizure, because the alternative they're presenting is worse." "It worked?" Eleanor asked. "Both times." His voice was flat. Not callous, just honest about what he'd witnessed. "Not this time," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She held his gaze without looking away. "No," he said, "not if I can help it." She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to know what was underneath the offer, what the Garrett family had cost him, what he was still carrying from it, what he was hoping to set down by picking this up. She decided against it for now, not because it didn't matter, but because some things revealed themselves through action better than through conversation, and she would learn more about Caleb Mercer from what he did in the next 11 days than from anything he told her tonight. The attorney, Pritchard, she said, he thinks there's a case around the condition of my husband's health at the time of signing. He's afraid of the judge. Hooper, Caleb said, which meant he'd already been asking around. Yes. Hooper can be worked around, Caleb said. Not easily, but there are channels. The circuit goes above him if you can establish a pattern, not just one bad contract, but a practice. Crow's been doing this for years. That's not one bad deal, that's fraud. Federal fraud, if the right people are looking at it. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. You think you can find those people? I think I know where some of the pieces are, he said. I'm not promising anything I can't deliver, Mrs. Voss. I want to be clear about that. I've been in situations where promising more than I had was the kindest thing I could think to do, and it didn't go well. What I can tell you is I know some attorneys in other counties who have been building cases against operations like Crow's, and I know a federal marshal who has been looking for grounds on this specific region for close to 3 years. He wasn't selling her anything. That was what she noticed most. His voice had none of the quality of persuasion. It was informational, careful, almost uncomfortably honest about the limitations. She'd been sold things by men in this kitchen before. She knew the smell of it. This wasn't that. Stay the night, she said. There's a room off the barn. It's cold, but it's dry. He nodded. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it yet, she said. I haven't decided what I think of you. That's fair, he said. He finished his coffee. He stood up and took his cup to the basin, which was something Thomas had never done in 12 years, and which Eleanor registered without meaning to. He went out to the barn. She sat at the table for a long time after he left, the contract in front of her, the coffee going cold, the sound of Clara's breathing coming through the thin wall from where the girl had fallen asleep an hour ago. Eleanor put her finger on the clause. Dependence therein. She thought about Thomas signing this while his mind was running at half its power, trusting the man across the desk because the man across the desk was smiling. She thought about Crow sitting in this chair, not asking, not knocking. She thought about the Garrett children, split up between relations because a stranger on a road had minded his own business. Then she picked up the contract, folded it precisely along its original lines, and set it in the cedar box where Thomas had kept important things. She had 11 days. She went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Caleb was already up when Eleanor came out at first light. She could see him through the kitchen window before she opened the door. He was at the far end of the paddock fence, checking the posts along the east rail, testing each one with both hands, the way you do when you're deciding which need replacing now and which can wait another season. He wasn't doing it because she'd asked him to. He was just doing it because it was morning and there was work visible, and he was the kind of man who couldn't stand next to something broken without at least understanding how broken it was. She watched him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she put the coffee on. He came in when he smelled it, knocked this time, waited at the door. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. 3 posts on the east line need replacing before winter, he said, sitting down. The corner brace is sound, but the cross members got rot starting at the base. You've got maybe 1 more season on it. I know, she said. I've been patching it. It's past patching. I know that too. She set his coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup the same way she did, both hands, like it was something to hold on to rather than something to drink. She didn't know what to make of that, so she didn't make anything of it. Clara appeared in the doorway to the back room, hair unsettled, wearing her 2 big work shirt that had been Thomas's and that she refused to give up despite the fact that it came down to her knees. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. You stayed, Clara said, like she'd been running the odds on it. I stayed, he said. Clara came to the table and sat down and pulled the bread toward her without asking, which was how she operated at breakfast. And Caleb said nothing about it and helped himself to bread only after Clara had taken what she wanted. Eleanor watched that too without appearing to. They ate without talking much, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her. Most silences with strangers had weight to them. The pressure of things not yet said, the work of figuring each other out. This one was quieter than that, not without tension, just workable. "I need to go back into town today," Caleb said when the bread was mostly gone. "I want to talk to Pritchard before Crow's people can get to him again." "You think they'll go back to him?" "I think they went back to him last night," he said. "That's how this kind of operation works. They don't threaten loudly, they just visit. They ask questions that aren't questions. They make sure people know who's paying attention to what." Eleanor thought about Pritchard, the thin man with the spectacles and the careful voice who had said too long, perhaps when he talked about keeping things locked in a cabinet. "He said he'd help," she said. "He said he would if it came to that," Caleb said. "That's a different thing. We need him to help before it comes to that, not after." He pushed back from the table. "Can I take a look at the full contract again before I go? Both pages." She got the cedar box. He spread the contract on the table and read it again, and she sat across from him and watched his face while he read, which was something she'd started doing as a habit with Thomas, because Thomas's face when he was reading something troubling went through a sequence she'd learned to decode, and she wanted to know if Caleb had a similar sequence. He did, though it was more compressed. A slight tightening around the eyes when he hit something that mattered. A stillness in his jaw that was different from his general stillness. He hit it twice while reading the contract. Once on the second page, the clause she already knew about. Once on the first page, somewhere she hadn't paid enough attention to. "This line," he said, turning the contract to face her and pointing. "Right here. The one about the survey date." She leaned forward and read it. It referenced the original land survey of the Voss property as documentation of collateral, dated September 1882. "I see it," she said. "What about it?" "The survey date is 6 weeks before the loan was signed, which normally wouldn't matter. But I've seen this before, in a case out of Harlan County 2 years back. Crow's Bank used surveys that had been quietly altered after the fact. The survey on file at the county office shows a slightly different acreage than the survey in the borrower's copy of the contract." Eleanor stared at the number on the page. 407 acres. She had always understood the ranch to be 412 acres. Thomas had said it that way, always. She'd seen it written that way in the original deed, the one from when they'd first filed. 5 acres, she said. 5 acres that shouldn't exist on paper if the survey was clean, Caleb said. But which could mean a different legal boundary if someone wanted to argue it. It could be nothing. But in the Harlan case, it wasn't nothing. It was how they moved the fence line after seizure without technically trespassing. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She thought about how patient Crow had been. Coming in without knocking, sitting in someone else's kitchen chair, speaking in that flat, pleasant voice like a man who already knew how the story ended. This was a man who didn't get impatient because he didn't need to. He'd already planned for every door. "What do we do about it?" she asked. "I need the original deed," Caleb said, "the one you filed when you first took possession. If it says 412 and the contract says 407, and the survey on file at the county office says something different from both. That's 3 separate documents that don't agree. That's not a clerical error. That's either fraud or something I would ask a lot of uncomfortable questions about in a courtroom." "The original deed is in that box," Eleanor said. She pulled it out. He compared the 2 documents side by side. She watched his jaw do the thing. 412, he said, tapping the deed. 407, tapping the contract. "I'm going to need to see the county copy, which means someone needs to go to the county recorder's office, which is not in Red Hollow." "Millhaven," Eleanor said. Millhaven was the county seat, 14 miles north. "I can go today," he said, "after I talk to Pritchard." "That's a lot of ground in one day." "I've covered worse." She wasn't going to argue the point. She was trying to do the calculation of what she could verify and what she had to take on faith, and it came out uneven, the way those calculations always did. The faith side heavier than she wanted. "Take the deed," she said. "Don't leave it anywhere." He folded it carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. He stood up. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "If I'm not, don't—" He stopped. "Don't what?" "Don't let anyone in who you didn't invite," he said. "I know that sounds— It sounds like you think Crow might send someone out here while you're gone," she said. He didn't answer, which was an answer. "Clara and I will manage," Eleanor said. with more steadiness than she felt. He was gone by 7 in the morning. Eleanor spent the first hour after he left doing the kind of work that needed doing, regardless of everything else. Feeding the cattle, checking the water levels in the troughs, patching a stretch of fence on the west line that had been pulling loose for a week. Clara came with her, carrying the wire coil and the pliers without being asked, handing things over at the right moment, talking about Chester's behavior the previous evening in a way that was partly information and partly just the filling of silence. Eleanor let her talk. She needed the sound. By 9 o'clock she was back at the house, and that was when she saw the rider. He came from the south, not the road, which meant he'd come across the open pasture rather than through town. He was riding a gray horse she didn't recognize, and he was dressed like a working man, plain canvas jacket, nothing to catch the eye. But he was riding at a pace that had nothing working about it. Too deliberate, too pointed. She told Clara to go inside without raising her voice about it. Clara went without arguing, which told Eleanor that the girl had already seen the rider and had already drawn her own conclusions. Eleanor stood at the paddock gate and waited. The man pulled up about 20 yards out. He was perhaps 40, with a flat, uninteresting face that she thought was probably useful for certain kinds of work. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "That's right. Mr. Crow asked me to come out and see how you're getting on, in light of the timeline." "Mr. Crow can come himself if he has something to say to me," Eleanor said. The man smiled a little. "He wanted me to let you know that there's still time to resolve this quietly, before it goes any further." "Further than what?" He looked past her at the house. His eyes moved over it the way Crow's had moved over the table. A look of possession that hadn't officially happened yet, but felt inevitable to the man doing the looking. "Mr. Crow is prepared to offer you a settlement," he said. "You'd sign the property over voluntarily. He'd allow you 60 days to arrange your affairs and find other accommodation. He'd—" A pause, calibrated. "Consider the dependent question resolved." There it was. She'd known it was coming. She'd felt it since she read the clause. The way you feel a storm before it arrives, not by seeing it, but by what the air does. "You can tell Mr. Crow," Eleanor said, "that I'll be in town on Monday. If he wants to talk settlement, he can say so to my attorney." The man's expression didn't change. "Mr. Crow hoped you'd be more reasonable." "I'm being very reasonable," Eleanor said. "I'm offering him a conversation through legal channels. That's the most reasonable thing I can think of." He held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away. She'd learned over 14 months of managing things alone that looking away first had a cost you couldn't always afford. He turned the horse around and rode back south the way he'd come. Eleanor waited until he was over the rise and out of sight. Then she went inside, where Clara was standing at the kitchen window with her arms folded. "What did he want?" Clara asked. "To make us feel like we'd already lost," Eleanor said. "Did it work?" Eleanor looked at her daughter. The too big shirt, the hair that still needed cutting, the eyes that were too old but were old in the right direction. "Not yet," Eleanor said. Caleb came back at 4:30. He tied his horse and came straight to the house, and Eleanor knew from the way he was moving, not fast but with something in it, that he'd found something. She had coffee waiting. He sat down, pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat, and spread it on the table alongside the original deed she'd returned to the cedar box. County Recorder's Office had 3 surveys on file for this property, he said. The original from when you first filed. That matches your deed. 412 acres. Then there's a resurvey filed in August of 1882, 1 month before the date on the contract survey. That one says 409 acres. 3 fewer than the deed, Eleanor said, and 2 fewer than the contract's figure, which is 407. He pointed to the paper he'd brought. This is my copy of what's on file at the county. Now here's the part that matters. That August resurvey was not filed by you, was not filed by Thomas. It was filed by a survey company out of the county seat, a company called Meridian Land and Assessment. Eleanor looked at the name. I've never heard of them, she said. I hadn't either, but Pritchard had. Caleb sat back. Meridian Land and Assessment has done survey work for 6 properties in this county over the past 4 years. All 6 had outstanding loans through Crow's Bank. All 6 subsequently defaulted. All 6, when they defaulted, had boundary disputes as part of the seizure process. The room was very quiet. The wind had come up outside, moving through the grass with that particular sound that felt like the land talking to itself. He surveyed them, Eleanor said. Before they defaulted, he moved the numbers in advance. That's the argument, Caleb said. It's not proven yet, but 6 properties, same survey company, same bank, same pattern of default and dispute. A judge who doesn't owe Crow anything would look at that very hard. Pritchard, she said. Pritchard is in. I think seeing Crow's man come back after you left yesterday, that settled something for him. He pulled out 2 of those other case files while I was there. He's been holding on to records he never had occasion to use. Caleb paused. He's scared. I want to be honest about that. He's not a brave man by temperament, but I think he's tired of being scared, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. Eleanor thought about what Crow's man had said that morning. He hoped you'd be more reasonable. The settlement offer, with its 60 days and its careful mention of the dependent question resolved, dangled like bait over something with teeth. He sent someone out here today, she said, while you were gone. Caleb looked at her. Settlement offer, she said. Sign over the property voluntarily. 60 days to find other accommodation. He referenced Clara. A muscle moved in Caleb's jaw. Not much. Enough. That's what I expected, he said, quieter than before. He's feeling something. Not pressure exactly, but some disturbance in how he thought this would go. If it was completely settled in his mind, he wouldn't be sending settlement offers. Or he does it every time, as standard practice, Eleanor said, to make the offer part of the record, so later it looks like he tried to be fair. Caleb looked at her. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. A recognition, maybe, of something he hadn't anticipated. Yes, he said. That's also likely true, probably both. She appreciated that he didn't try to make it simpler than it was. That was something she'd had to manage alone for too long. The way people wanted to simplify your situation down to something they could feel good about, either reassuring you it would work out or painting it as hopeless, anything to avoid sitting with the complicated actual shape of it. What's next? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Pritchard wants to file for a temporary injunction on the transfer, Caleb said. That buys us time. Delays the note maturation while the survey discrepancy is investigated. He thinks he can get it, but it has to go through the district office, not local court, which means Hooper doesn't touch it. How long does that take? Filing is tomorrow if Pritchard moves fast. Response could be 3 days, could be a week. In the meantime, he stopped. In the meantime, what? In the meantime, we need more people, he said. The survey fraud alone might be enough to get an injunction. It won't be enough to break what Crow's built here. For that, you need the other families. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. The other 5 properties. Some of them lost their land years ago, but some of those people are still in the county, still in Red Hollow or close to it. If even 2 or 3 of them are willing to talk to Pritchard, to put their names on a statement, the case stops being about one widow contesting one note and starts being about a pattern. That's different, federally different. Eleanor knew what he was asking. She knew what those families had been through. She knew, too, that going to them meant asking people who had already lost everything to put themselves at risk for someone who still had something. That was a particular kind of ask. It had a weight to it that you couldn't minimize. I know some of them, she said slowly. The Hargrove family. They lost their place 3 years ago. Will Hargrove works at the mill now. His wife takes in sewing. She paused. There's also the Delaney widow. She lost her place 2 years back. I brought her food a few times after. She's living in a room above the dry goods store. Would they talk to me? They might talk to me, Eleanor said. Whether they'd put their names on paper, I don't know. That's a different thing. It is, he said. He wasn't pushing. He was being precise about what the step would cost, which she was coming to understand was his particular discipline, the refusal to make the hard things sound easier than they were, even when easier would have been more comfortable for everyone. I'll go to them, she said. Tomorrow morning. He nodded. There's something else, he said. He said it in a way that told her this was the part he'd been turning over on the ride back. Tell me. When I was in Mill Haven, at the county office, I ran into someone, a man named Garrett. The name landed strangely. She'd heard it once the night before in the road outside of town. A family named Garrett. She hadn't asked then. She asked now. The same Garrett? She said. His son, Caleb said. The oldest boy. He'd be about 20 now. He was there filing some kind of work claim, I think. We were waiting at the same window. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. He recognized my name. I'd introduced myself to the father back when I came through that town 2 years ago. Eleanor waited. He was civil about it, Caleb said. More civil than he needed to be. He said his mother was living with his aunt in a town across the state line. Said his 2 youngest sisters had been placed with a family neither of them knew. Said his father had taken work in the mines, and they hadn't heard from him in 8 months. He paused. He said it all very evenly, like someone who's organized their grief into something they can carry. He stopped talking. Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment. You didn't know it would go that way, she said finally. I knew something was going to go some way, he said. That's not the same as not knowing. He picked up his coffee. It was cold by now. He drank it anyway. I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why I'm going to do everything I can think of to not let this end the same way. And I want you to know that that's not entirely clean. My reasons. Nobody's reasons are entirely clean, Eleanor said. He looked at her. She meant it, and he could tell she meant it, and that seemed to settle something between them that didn't need any more words. That night, after Clara was asleep, Eleanor sat with the cedar box open on the table. Not the contract. She'd looked at that enough. The deed, the original one, with Thomas's signature at the bottom, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who'd taught himself to write as an adult and never stopped being proud of being able to do it. She thought about Thomas signing the loan, feverish, confused, trusting the man across the desk. She thought about whether Thomas had known, somewhere underneath the fever, that something was wrong. She thought she would never know that, and that not knowing it was one of the things she'd have to carry alongside all the other things. She folded the deed back up. She looked at the wall across from her, the one with the window that looked out toward the east pasture, the one Thomas had put 2 extra inches of insulation into because that wall caught the winter wind. He hadn't been a man who knocked when he came into his own kitchen either. She thought about that. There were things about Thomas she'd spent 14 months rewriting in memory, smoothing down, making cleaner than they'd been while he was alive. She was trying to stop doing that. It didn't serve him, and it didn't serve her. He had loved this land. He had loved Clara with an impracticality that surprised her, given how practical he was about everything else. He had signed a bad contract because he was desperate and sick, and a man with a plan had been smiling across the desk. He had not been perfect. Neither was she. Neither, she was fairly sure, was the quiet man sleeping in the room off the barn, who carried his own failure around with him like something he refused to set down even when it was hurting his back. But they were here, and Crow had been so certain she was already beaten that he'd sent a representative instead of coming himself. That was, she thought, his first real mistake. She put the cedar box away. She looked at the clock on the shelf. It had been Thomas's mother's, and it ran 3 minutes fast, and she'd never bothered to correct it, because by now the 3 minutes felt like hers. 9:47. She went to bed. She was asleep before 10, which was the first time that had happened in 6 months. The Hargrove house was not a house anymore. That was the first thing Eleanor registered when she turned down the lane that she remembered from 3 years back, when Will Hargrove had still been running cattle on the south section, and Margaret Hargrove had kept a kitchen garden that the whole county knew about. The lane was there. The cottonwood trees on either side were there, a little taller, a little more ragged at the crown. But the house at the end of it belonged to someone else now. She could see that from the fresh paint on the shutters, the new fence posts along the front, the particular tidiness of a property that had been taken over by someone who wanted to make clear they'd improved on what they'd found. She turned back to the road without going all the way down. Will Hargrove was at the mill. She knew that. She'd said it herself to Caleb the night before. She went to the mill. The Red Hollow Mill sat at the south end of town where the creek ran wide enough to be useful, and it was loud in a way that got into your chest, the grinding and the turning of it producing a vibration that you felt before you heard it. Will Hargrove was on the loading platform when she arrived, stacking finished lumber with two other men, moving with the efficient unhappiness of someone who had made peace with work he hadn't chosen. He was 41 years old. Eleanor remembered him as a man who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who owns land he put his own sweat into, and that man was still visible underneath the present one, but only just, the way an old pencil line shows through paint if the paint isn't quite thick enough. He saw her coming and set down the plank he was holding. "Mrs. Voss," he said. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the specific wariness of a person who has been through something bad and is trying to calculate whether the person coming toward them is bringing more of it or something different. "Will," she said, "can you take a few minutes?" He looked back at the other men, then at her. He came down off the platform. They stood at the edge of the creek, out of earshot. She told him what she'd found: the survey discrepancy, meridian land and assessment, the pattern of 6 properties. She watched his face while she talked. He listened the way people listen when they're hearing something confirm what they already suspected, but had stopped allowing themselves to think about, because thinking about it was too expensive emotionally. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He picked up a stone from the bank and turned it in his fingers. "I knew something was wrong with the survey," he said. "When they came out in August, I didn't hire them, didn't know who sent them. They said it was a routine county assessment. I didn't question it." He let the stone drop. "By the time I understood what it was for, we'd already lost the place." "Would you talk to an attorney?" Eleanor asked. "His name is Pritchard. He has the other files. He's filing for an injunction on my transfer this week. If you added your name—" "Crow destroyed us, Eleanor." He said it plainly, without drama, which made it worse. "Margaret takes in sewing. I work 60 hours a week at that mill, and I still can't save enough to lease anything worth having. My kids share a room in a boarding house. We're not—" He stopped. "We're not in a position to take on a fight." "I know," she said. "I know what I'm asking." "Do you?" She held his gaze. "Yes, I do. I'm not pretending it's nothing. I'm asking anyway." He looked at the creek, the mill ground on behind them. A bird crossed the water low and fast and was gone. "If I put my name on something," he said slowly, "and it doesn't work, if Crow beats it the way he's beaten everything else, there are things he can still do to us. Margaret's sewing clients, my position at the mill. The man who owns the mill has a loan through Crow's bank. Did you know that?" "I didn't know that." "Most people in this town have something through Crow's bank. That's not an accident." He turned back to her. "Give me until tomorrow morning. Let me talk to Margaret." It was not a yes, but it was not the no she'd half expected, and she took it and thanked him and left him at the creek. The Delaney widow lived above the dry goods store on the second block of Main Street, in 2 rooms that Eleanor had never seen but had always imagined as small, because everything about Nora Delaney's life since losing her property had contracted. She was 53 years old, had been a rancher's wife for 26 of them, and had been a widow for 4. She opened the door when Eleanor knocked and stood in the doorway without inviting her in, which told Eleanor that the contraction had reached the social rooms too. "Eleanor Voss," Nora said. Her voice was dry and flat, the voice of someone who had rationed their warmth for a long time and was careful about spending it. "Nora, can I come in?" A pause. Then Nora stepped back. The rooms were not as small as Eleanor had imagined. They were spare. A table, 2 chairs, a cot behind a curtain, but they were clean, and there was a window that looked down onto the street below, and on the sill was a single pot with a geranium in it, very red, tended with obvious care. The geranium was the only thing in the room that didn't look braced against something. Eleanor told her the same things she'd told Will Hargrove. Nora listened without the wariness Will had shown. She listened with the flatness of someone who had moved past wariness into a more permanent state. When Eleanor finished, Nora said, "I know about Meridian." Eleanor stopped. "You know?" "I figured it out after. Not right away. Maybe 6 months after I'd lost the place." Nora sat down at the table. She didn't offer Eleanor a chair, but she did not offer one either, so Eleanor sat. I went back through everything I still had. I'd been too numb to look at it close for a while. But when I did, there it was. That survey company name. I'd never hired them. I'd never heard of them. And then I found out the date they'd filed, and it was... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. It was before I defaulted, before anyone would have had reason to survey. They did it in advance. They were planning it before it happened. Nora, Eleanor said, an attorney named Pritchard is filing an injunction on my property transfer this week. He has evidence of a pattern. He needs names. To what end? Nora's voice was not cruel. It was just bare. To take this to a district court, above Hooper. At Hooper's name, something moved in Nora's face. Not surprise, the opposite of surprise. Hooper was at Crow's house for dinner the month before my hearing, she said. I found that out later, too. Found it out from the woman who cooked for Crow at the time. She's gone now, moved away. But she told me before she left. Nora looked at her hands on the table. I put it in a letter to the district office, the county administrator, 2 newspapers. You know what I heard back? Eleanor shook her head. Nothing, Nora said. Not one word. The room was quiet. On the sill, the geranium sat in its pot, determinedly red. I have a man helping me, Eleanor said. His name is Caleb Mercer. He knows people in other jurisdictions. He thinks there's a federal angle if we can show a pattern across enough properties. Nora looked at her steadily. You trust this man? Eleanor thought about that question the way it deserved to be thought about, not quickly. Not completely, she said, but enough. And I'm running out of options that don't require trusting someone. Nora was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the geranium. She looked at her hands. I'll talk to your attorney, she said. I'm not promising more than that. That's more than I had an hour ago, Eleanor said. She was back at the ranch by noon. Caleb had spent the morning writing out a careful summary of the survey evidence, cross-referencing the dates and property records he'd brought back from Millhaven, organizing it into the kind of document that Pritchard could use as a foundation. He'd spread it across the kitchen table, and when Eleanor came in, he was reading back through it with a pencil, marking things. He looked up when she came in. Read her face. Hargrove's thinking about it, she said. Delaney said she'd talked to Pritchard. He nodded. That's something. It might have to be enough for now. It might, he said. He didn't try to inflate it. How are they? It was not a question she'd expected. She stopped in the act of taking her coat off. Hargrove's tired, she said. The kind of tired that's been going on too long to fix with sleep. Nora Delaney wrote letters to every official she could think of and heard nothing back. She's... Eleanor paused, looking for the right word and not wanting to use the wrong one. Sealed, she said finally. She sealed herself off, but she came to the door. She let me in. She said she'd talk. Caleb set his pencil down. She wrote letters, and no one answered. Not one. He turned that over. Eleanor could see him filing it alongside other things he knew, organizing it. That might actually help, he said, if she documented what she sent and when, and we can show those letters went unanswered. That's not just Crow operating badly. That's the machinery around him failing on purpose, or being made to fail. Hooper, Eleanor said. And whoever Hooper answers to, Caleb said, which is who we need to find. He'd been in contact, he told her, with a man named Aldous Webb, a federal marshal based 2 counties north, who had been building a file on land fraud operations in the region for close to 3 years. Caleb had crossed paths with Webb during the Harlan County situation, and they had kept an intermittent correspondence. He'd sent a letter from Millhaven the previous day, laying out the Meridian connection and the survey dates. He'll come if I give him enough, Caleb said. He's been waiting for a case with enough documentation to take seriously. This might be it. Might be, Eleanor said. I'm not making promises, he said. I know, I've noticed. She said it without particular inflection, but something in it made him look at her for a moment longer than the words required. She moved to the stove to start something for lunch, and he went back to his papers, and for a while the kitchen had the sound of 2 people working in the same space without getting in each other's way, which was its own kind of thing. Clara came in from outside at some point. tracked mud across the floor without noticing, then noticed Eleanor noticing and went back to the door and took her boots off. She came to look over Caleb's shoulder at his papers. "What are all those numbers?" she asked. "Land measurements," he said. "Survey records." "What's a survey?" "It's when someone measures how big a piece of land is and writes it down officially, so everyone agrees on the boundaries." Clara considered this. What if someone writes it down wrong on purpose? Caleb looked at her. "Then it's called fraud." "Is that what Crow did?" A beat. "That's what we're trying to prove." Clara nodded, satisfied with the precision of the answer, and went to help Eleanor at the stove. Pritchard came out to the ranch that afternoon, which surprised Eleanor. She'd expected to go to him. He arrived with his leather case and his spectacles, and the particular purposefulness of a man who has decided something and is in motion before he can think himself out of it. He laid his papers on the table beside Caleb's papers, and they spent 2 hours going through everything. The survey dates, the deed, the contract language, the Meridian connection, what Nora Delaney had told Eleanor about the unanswered letters. Pritchard asked precise questions. Caleb answered them precisely. Eleanor filled in the parts that needed a resident's knowledge. Which officials were local, which were county, which owed their positions to relationships she could name. At the end of 2 hours, Pritchard took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "The injunction application goes out tomorrow morning," he said. "I'm filing it at the district level, citing survey fraud and the constitutional questions around the dependent clause. We have enough for that." He paused. "The larger case, the pattern across multiple properties, that requires more time and more testimony. The injunction buys us time." "How much time?" Eleanor asked. "If it's granted, it could stay the transfer for 30 to 60 days while the district reviews the evidence. During that period, Crow cannot legally proceed with seizure." "And if it's not granted?" Pritchard was quiet for a moment. He put his spectacles back on. "Then we have 9 days," he said, "and we use them." It was the most honest answer he could have given, and it settled in the room with a weight that nobody tried to lighten. After Pritchard left, Eleanor washed the cups, and Clara set the table for dinner, and Caleb went out to check the cattle, because the wind had shifted north in the afternoon, and there was something in it that made experienced people check on animals. Eleanor watched him through the window as he moved through the paddock in the fading light, methodical, checking each fence section, not hurrying. She thought about Thomas again. She was doing that less, lately, or differently. Not the grief shape of it, but something more like a conversation she was having with him in her head, accounting for things, explaining the present situation in terms of what he would have understood and what he would have argued about and what he would have surprised her by accepting. She thought he would have liked Caleb. Not immediately. Thomas hadn't liked anyone immediately, but eventually, in the way he occasionally liked people who were straight with him about things. She thought he would have argued about the federal marshal idea. Thomas had a complicated relationship with federal authority that came from his Ohio upbringing and some experience she'd never gotten the full story on. But he would have come around, she thought. In the end, he always went toward what worked, even when he fought it first. She was still at the window when Clara appeared at her elbow. "You're watching him again," Clara said. Eleanor looked down at her daughter. "I was thinking." "You were doing both," Clara said, without accusation, just observation. Eleanor turned back to the stove. The trouble came the next morning. Not from the direction she'd expected. She'd been braced for another rider from Crow, another visit like the flat-faced man on the gray horse. She'd been braced for some legal maneuver, some counterfiling, something that used the machinery of debt and documentation that Crow was so practiced at operating. What she had not been braced for was Caleb coming in from town at 10 in the morning with a different kind of look on his face. Not urgency exactly, but a compression, the look of someone managing something they hadn't expected to have to manage. He sat down at the table. "Crow knows about the federal marshal inquiry," he said. Eleanor sat down across from him. "How?" "I don't know. It might be the letter I sent from Millhaven, someone at the postal office, someone at the marshal's office. It might be that Crow has ears in enough places that anything moving in this county reaches him eventually." He put both hands flat on the table. "He went to see 2 people this morning. The first was Will Hargrove." Eleanor felt it before he said the rest of it. Crow told Hargrove that if he spoke to Pritchard, his position at the mill would be gone by the end of the week, Caleb said. He didn't put it as a threat. He put it as a concern, as a friendly warning. That's how he operates. Will, Eleanor said quietly. Hargrove sent word to Pritchard this morning. He's out. Caleb's voice was flat, not unsympathetic, flat in the way that reality sometimes is, resisting interpretation. I can't blame him. He's got a family. I know, Eleanor said. She meant it. She did know. Knowing it didn't make it easier. The second person Crow visited was Dr. Hale. Eleanor looked up. He didn't threaten Hale directly, Caleb said. He came as a patient, came in complaining of some minor thing, sat in the examination room, made conversation. At the end of the conversation, he mentioned that he'd heard Hale had been discussing the medical histories of former patients. He said he hoped that wasn't true, because of course a man of Hale's reputation wouldn't want to be associated with legal proceedings that might be found to be frivolous. He said he had a great deal of respect for Hale's practice and would hate to see it complicated by something like that. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara was outside, out of earshot. Eleanor could hear the windmill turning. Did Hale say anything back? She asked. According to Hale, he said nothing. He let Crow leave. Caleb paused. He sent for me an hour later. He told me everything Crow said, word for word, from memory. He said he wanted me to know what we were dealing with. Another pause. He didn't say he was pulling out, but he didn't say he was staying in either. Eleanor looked at the table, at the grain of the wood which she had traced with her finger 1,000 times across the years without ever deciding to. Crow is not stupid, she said. No, he's very precise about where he applies pressure. Caleb's voice had something in it that she'd heard before, in the road that first day, the quality of a man who had rehearsed what failure looked like and was checking the present moment against it. He's not trying to destroy everyone at once. He's removing the people around us one at a time, leaving us standing in the middle of a cleared space. So we look isolated, Eleanor said. When it gets to a hearing, we look like people making unsupported claims. Yes. She pressed her hands flat on the table the way she'd pressed them on the contract, the way she'd been pressing hands on flat surfaces since this started, like she was trying to keep things from sliding. What about Nora Delaney? She asked. I don't know yet. She wasn't on his list this morning, as far as I can tell. But she will be? She should be warned. I'm going to her this afternoon. He was thinking ahead of the problem. She could see it. The way he moved through the implications in order, dealing with each one without skipping to the end. She had been doing that herself for 14 months, which was perhaps why she recognized it in someone else. There's something I haven't told you, Caleb said. She looked at him. Crow's second visit this morning, after Hale, was to the boarding house where I've been staying in town. He came in person this time, no representative. Caleb kept his eyes on the table for a moment, then raised them to hers. He asked the landlady how long I'd been staying and whether I'd mentioned my plans. She told him I'd been out there. He indicated the ranch with a slight movement of his head. He told her, in front of 2 other boarders, deliberately, that I was known in other counties as someone who involved himself in legal disputes on behalf of desperate parties in exchange for a share of any settlement. He used the word predatory. Eleanor was very still. He called you a predator, she said. He called me an opportunist preying on a vulnerable widow, Caleb said. His voice was even. Too even, she thought. Which is a thing that will sound plausible to some people and will be in circulation by tomorrow morning, and which will reach Pritchard and reach the district court if we get that far, as a preemptive framing. She thought about how it would sound. A stranger arrives in a town where a widow is in financial trouble. The stranger offers help. The stranger becomes involved in legal proceedings that, if successful, save the widow's property. A property that would need to be managed, that might need a partner, that might... She cut off her own thought. Is it true? She asked. She asked it without heat. It was a factual question. He looked at her. No, I've never taken money from anyone in a situation like this. I've never settled anything that involved property I had any claim to. Have you done this before? Involved yourself in these situations? Once, he said. In Harlan County. It didn't end. The way this needs to end. Why did it fail? He was quiet for a moment. Because I waited too long to push and then pushed too hard at the wrong moment, and the whole thing fell apart in a way that might have been avoided. He said it with the precision of someone who had thought it through so many times it had become a kind of catechism. I'm not planning to make the same mistake again. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She understood that a person could be telling the truth about one thing and have other things underneath it that were more complicated. She understood that Caleb Mercer was a man with a history she only partly knew, operating from motivations that were not entirely clean, as he'd said himself. She also understood that he had told her that, unprompted. Crow is trying to isolate us and discredit you at the same time, she said, which means he's worried. He's protecting a position, Caleb said. People protect positions when they feel them being threatened. Then we're threatening him, Eleanor said. We're threatening him, he confirmed. She stood up. She went to the window. The cattle were in the south pasture, drifting slowly the way they did when nothing was wrong. The particular undirected movement of animals that have enough water and enough grass and no immediate concern. She had spent 14 months trying to keep enough water in the troughs and enough grass in the pasture for exactly that quality of movement. And there was something about seeing it, the ordinary, the continuing, that settled something in her that had been loose all morning. We don't fall apart, she said. She wasn't talking to Caleb exactly. She was talking to the window, to the cattle, to herself. He wants us to. He's done everything to make it happen. Taken away Hargrove, shaken Hale, put a story in circulation about you. He wants us to decide it's too much. Eleanor, Caleb said, from the table behind her. She turned. The injunction application is already filed, he said. Pritchard put it in this morning before any of this happened. Whatever Crow does now, that application is at the district office. The evidence is in it. The survey dates, the meridian connection, the deed discrepancy. All of it is already in front of people who don't owe Crow anything. She hadn't known that. The morning had moved so fast. He filed it? She said. First thing, Caleb said. Before he'd even had breakfast, from what he said. She thought about Pritchard, the thin man with the neat handwriting who had sat on things too long and had, apparently, decided he was done sitting on them. Then Crow is already too late to stop it, she said. For the injunction, yes. The larger case is still being built. He paused. But yes, for the injunction, he's already too late. The windmill turned outside. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The clock on the shelf ran 3 minutes fast, the way it always had. Eleanor turned back to the room. Then we keep building, she said. Nora Delaney did not wait to be warned. When Caleb arrived at the dry goods store that afternoon, Nora was already downstairs, coat on, a small leather folder under her arm. She looked at Caleb with the flat directness that Eleanor had described and said, I assume you're the man with the federal marshal contact. I am, he said. Good. I have copies of every letter I sent in 1881 and the year after, including the dates, the recipients, and, she held up the folder, the certified mail records proving delivery. If your marshal wants to see what the official response to documented fraud looks like in this county, I have 2 years of evidence that it looks like silence. Caleb stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her for a moment. Crow hasn't come to you yet? He said. He might, she said. I'm 63 days behind on my room rent, and I have $17. I think perhaps he calculated I was already neutralized. She put on her hat with the brisk efficiency of someone who has not had a lot of patience for wasted motion in a long time. He calculated wrong. Caleb went back to the ranch with the folder. He spread the letters on the kitchen table beside his own papers, beside Pritchard's notes, and Eleanor stood over them and read them. Nora Delaney's careful handwriting across page after page, sent to officials who had received them, signed for them, and responded with nothing. 2 years of nothing. That night, Eleanor wrote her own letter. Not to an official, to Aldous Webb, the federal marshal, whose address Caleb gave her. She wrote it in her own hand, not Caleb's, not Pritchard's, because she thought it mattered that it came from the person whose land and whose daughter were at the center of this. She wrote it plainly and without drama, laying out the facts in order the way Caleb had taught her to think about them over the past few days. Survey dates, deed discrepancies, meridian land and assessment, 6 properties, the unanswered letters, the dependent clause. At the end of it, she wrote, "I am not asking for special consideration. I am asking for someone to look at the evidence and do what the evidence requires." She signed it with her full name, Eleanor Ruth Voss. She sealed it and gave it to Caleb, and he had it on the morning post out of town before the sun was fully up. Then she went back to the ranch and kept working, because the cattle still needed water, and the fence still needed watching, and the land didn't pause for legal proceedings any more than it paused for grief. And she had always understood that the way you held something was by continuing to hold it every day, regardless of what was moving toward you down the road. She was still holding it. The district office responded in 4 days. Eleanor was at the fence line on the east pasture when Caleb came out from town with the letter, and she knew from the pace of his horse that it wasn't bad news. Bad news didn't make a horse move like that, with the particular forward lean of someone who has been waiting to deliver something and is finally in motion. She climbed down from the fence rail where she'd been working a loose post and pulled off her gloves and read the letter, standing in the pasture with the wind coming from the north and the cattle watching her from 20 yards off with their usual blank interest. The district court had granted a temporary injunction on the transfer of the Voss property. The language was formal and precise and several paragraphs long, but that was the substance of it. No transfer of title, no seizure of assets, no enforcement of the default clause, pending a full review of the survey discrepancy evidence submitted by A. Pritchard, Esquire. The review period was set at 45 days. A hearing date would be established within that window. Eleanor read it twice. She folded it back along its creases and held it at her side. 45 days, she said. At minimum, Caleb said. If the review extends, it could be longer, but 45 days is what we have guaranteed. She looked out at the pasture. The cattle had lost interest in her and gone back to grazing. The fence post she'd been working was still loose. She'd have to come back to it. The north wind was steady and cold and smelled like rain coming, maybe 2 days out. Pritchard should know, she said. I'm going to him next, Caleb said. I wanted you to have it first. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she'd started to recognize. Not expectant, not waiting for her to perform some particular emotion, just present in the way he was present, taking stock of what was there. Thank you, she said. She meant it without making too much of it. He nodded once and turned his horse back toward town. Eleanor went back to the fence post. She worked it for another 20 minutes until it was solid, stomping the base down, checking it from 2 angles. Then she moved to the next one. Pritchard received the injunction news with something that looked like relief but was too complicated to be entirely that. He sat behind his desk with the copy in his hands and read it the way he read everything. Carefully, front to back, no skimming. And when he set it down, his expression had the particular quality of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been allowed to set it in a different position, not put down, just shifted. 45 days, he said. To build the rest of it, Caleb said. He was sitting across from Pritchard, Eleanor beside him. Clara was at the ranch with Chester and the cattle, which she'd accepted with less argument than usual, as though she understood that this particular morning in town was adult business. The injunction is the injunction, Pritchard said. It holds the transfer. What it doesn't do is reverse anything. To pursue the broader case, the survey fraud pattern, the dependent clause across multiple contracts, we need a hearing. And for a hearing of that scope, we need testimony. Hale, Eleanor said. Dr. Hale is still uncertain. Pritchard looked at his desk. He came to see me yesterday. He told me about Crow's visit. He said he was not withdrawing, but he was not yet prepared to formalize his commitment. He paused. He's afraid. I know, Eleanor said. Can you give me until this afternoon with him? Pritchard and Caleb both looked at her. What will you say to him? Pritchard asked. I don't know yet, she said, but I think it should be me who says it. There was a pause. Caleb didn't argue. That was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't argue when someone else was right, even when the relinquishing of control cost him something. She went to Hale's office alone. He was between patients. sitting at his desk, writing up notes in the careful, methodical way that seemed to be the organizing principle of his existence. He looked up when she came in, and in his expression she saw the same thing Pritchard had described. The not withdrawing, the not committing, a man standing in a doorway unable to make himself go either direction. She sat down across from him without being invited, which was something she'd been doing more of lately. "I'm not going to ask you to be brave," she said. "I know what Crow said to you. I know what's at stake for your practice." He looked at her carefully. "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to tell me something honestly," she said. "When you looked at that ledger, when you saw the date of your examination, and then I told you the date of the contract signing, so what did you think?" He was quiet for a moment. He set his pen down. "I thought that a man who could not correctly identify the month of the year, as Mr. Voss could not when I examined him, was not capable of entering a legally binding contract," he said. "That's what I thought. And I thought that whoever had sat across from him and handed him a pen had known that." "Did you write that in the ledger?" "I wrote what I observed clinically. The inference is available to anyone who reads it and knows the date of the signing." "Then what you have is documentation," Eleanor said. "You don't have to make an argument. You don't have to interpret anything. You just have to be willing to read what you wrote in front of the right people and confirm that it's accurate." He looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man. She was asking him to be careful in public, which was different from being careful in private, and he was old enough to know the difference. "There are things Crow could do to my practice," he said. "Yes," she said. "And there are things that happen to a man who watches someone get robbed and says nothing because he was afraid of making trouble. Those things are also real. They live in you differently, but they live in you." She hadn't planned to say that. It came out of some place that wasn't entirely strategic, some place that was simply tired of the way fear organized everything in this town into a shape that served one man. Hale looked at his ledger on the desk. He looked at his hands. "I'll testify," he said, "if it comes to a proper hearing with a district judge, not Hooper. I'll testify." "It will be a district judge," she said. "Pritchard has made sure of that." "Then I'll be there." She thanked him and stood up and was almost to the door when he said her name. She turned. "Your husband was a decent man," Hale said. "He was in a bad way when he signed that paper, and he trusted someone he shouldn't have. That's not a character failing. That's what desperation does to people." He paused. "He would be, I think he would be very surprised by what you've done in the last 2 weeks." Eleanor held the door handle for a moment. "He'd have argued about the federal marshal," she said. Hale almost smiled. "Yes, probably." She went back to Pritchard's office and told them Hale was in. Pritchard wrote it down. Caleb nodded. "Then we have something," Pritchard said. "We have the survey evidence, Nor Delaney's letters, and Hale's testimony about Thomas's condition. That's the shape of a case." He looked across his desk at both of them. "What I need now is the hearing itself. I filed for one at the district level. The response should come within 2 weeks." "Crow will fight the hearing," Caleb said. "Of course he will," Pritchard said. "He'll file counter-arguments. He'll dispute the survey evidence. He'll question the reliability of the medical records. He'll do everything available to him. The question is whether what we have is strong enough to hold under that." "Is it?" Eleanor asked. Pritchard looked at her over his spectacles. "It's the strongest case I've put together in 20 years of practice in this county," he said. "Whether that's enough depends on factors none of us control." It was the most honest answer she'd heard from a lawyer in her life. She appreciated it and hated it equally. The response from Aldous Webb arrived 5 days later. Not a letter. The man himself. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard a horse she didn't recognize coming up the road, and she went to the window and saw a man she'd never seen before. Heavy-set, perhaps 50, riding a government-issue sorrel with the particular upright posture of someone who has spent decades on horseback and no longer thinks about it. He had a badge that caught the morning light as he came through the gate. Caleb came in from the barn when he heard the horse. He saw Webb and crossed the yard to meet him, and they shook hands with the brevity of men who have corresponded but not seen each other in years, the handshake doing the work of catching up. Eleanor came out onto the porch. Webb looked at her with the direct, impersonal assessment of a man who evaluates people as part of his professional practice and is neither unkind nor sentimental about it. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Aldous Webb, federal marshal, District 3. Your letter was clear and well organized. Thank you, she said. Come inside. He tied his horse and came in and sat at the table. The same chairs, though by now that table had held so many conversations of consequence that Eleanor had stopped thinking of it as furniture and started thinking of it as something closer to a working surface for the ongoing project of her survival. She made coffee. Webb had brought his own documents, a file that was thicker than she'd expected, manila folders with tabs on them. He laid them on the table and opened the first one. I've been building a file on land operations in this region for 31 months, he said. Crow's name appears in it 17 times, not always directly, sometimes through Meridian Land and Assessment, sometimes through associated lending instruments in 2 other counties. The pattern Mr. Mercer identified in his letter is consistent with what I've been tracking, but I've been lacking a strong enough single case to move on. A pattern without a compelling current instance is harder to take to a federal court. And now, Caleb said, now you have a current instance with documentation, an injunction already in place, and 2 corroborating witnesses. Webb looked at Eleanor. And a district hearing in the pipeline, from what Pritchard told me when I stopped there this morning. Eleanor looked at Caleb. You went to Pritchard first? Seemed the right order, Webb said mildly. I find it useful to know what the legal situation is before I sit down with the principals. He wasn't apologizing for it. He was explaining his method the way a craftsman explains his sequence of operations. This before that, because that's how it works. What can you do that the district hearing can't? Eleanor asked. The district hearing addresses your specific contract and the survey fraud in your specific case, Webb said. What I can do, if the hearing produces favorable findings, is use those findings as the foundation for a federal fraud investigation that covers all 6 properties. That takes Crow's operation apart at the institutional level rather than the individual case level. It also, frankly, gives us grounds to look at Judge Hooper's conduct, which is something I've been wanting to do for 2 years. He said all of it in the same even tone, the way you discussed the day's work before starting on it. Eleanor had expected something more dramatic from a federal marshal, some quality of authority that announced itself. What she got instead was competence, which she was coming to understand was rarer and more useful. What do you need from us? Caleb asked. For now, nothing you don't already have in motion, Webb said. I'll observe the hearing. If it goes the way the evidence suggests it should, I'll move on the federal case immediately after. If it doesn't go that way, he paused, then I'll need to have a conversation about why it didn't, and that conversation will be with people above the district level. Hooper's above the district level, Eleanor said, in terms of political connection to Crow. I know who Hooper knows, Webb said, and I know who Hooper's people know above that. Those connections are not as secure as Crow thinks they are. He closed his folder. The man has operated very effectively in a contained geography. Outside that geography, his leverage diminishes substantially. That's usually how it goes with this kind of operation. It works until someone with a wider view decides to look at it. He drank his coffee. He looked around the kitchen in the brief appraising way he looked at everything. Fine property, he said. Good elevation on the south pasture. My husband broke it over 7 years, Eleanor said. I can see the quality of the work, Webb said. Simply without performance. She liked him, she decided, not in the way you like people you want to spend time with, but in the way you like a good tool, because it's well made and honest about what it can and can't do. Crow's response to the injunction came 8 days after it was granted. Eleanor had been expecting it, had been waiting for it the way you wait for a storm when you can smell it in the air but haven't yet felt the wind shift. It came in the form of a counterfiling at the district office, accompanied by a legal brief from an attorney in the county seat named Bertram Cole, who was, Pritchard told her with the specific distaste of one professional assessing another, very good at his work. The counterfiling disputed the survey evidence on grounds that the county records were subject to clerical error and that Meridian Land and Assessment was a licensed firm whose work had been certified without objection at the time of filing. It disputed the medical testimony grounds on the basis that a doctor's private ledger was not a formal medical certification and that Dr. Hale had no documented record of advising Thomas Voss against signing any legal instrument. It included a sworn affidavit from the bank manager Fulton, the man who had been present at the signing, attesting that Thomas Voss had appeared competent and willing. It also included a statement about Caleb Mercer. Pritchard brought it out to the ranch and laid it on the kitchen table. The statement described Caleb as an itinerant agitator with a history of involving himself in land disputes in Harlan County, where his interference had complicated and ultimately harmed the interests of the parties he claimed to represent. It named 2 people in Harlan County who had provided statements to that effect. It suggested that Mercer's involvement in the Voss case was motivated by personal financial interest, and that any evidence he had gathered or testimony he had facilitated should be viewed in that light. Caleb read it without expression. Eleanor watched his face the way she had learned to watch it. "The Harlan County case," she said. "Yes." He set the paper down. "The 2 people who gave statements, I know who they are. One of them lost his case partly because I pushed for a public hearing before we had enough evidence, and he's been angry about it since. The other one I've never met, which means Crow's attorney found him through other means." "Could they discredit you in a hearing?" Pritchard asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "They could complicate it," he said. "If Crow's attorney calls them as witnesses and I'm on the stand, it creates a narrative. The narrative being that I'm someone who inserts himself into these situations and makes them worse." "Is there any truth to it?" Eleanor asked. He looked at her directly. "The Harlan case, yes. I pushed too hard too fast and the case fell apart before it should have. The family lost land they might have kept if I'd been more patient." He didn't dress it up or defend it. "No truth to the financial interest claim." Eleanor looked at Pritchard. "Can we prevent Crow from calling his Harlan County witnesses?" "We can object on relevance grounds," Pritchard said. "Whether the objection is sustained depends on the judge." He took off his spectacles. "This is a more aggressive counterfiling than I anticipated. Cole is thorough." "Crow hired the best he could find," Caleb said, "which tells you he's more worried than he was 2 weeks ago." "Or it tells you he's thorough," Eleanor said. "Like Webb said, he plans for everything." "Both can be true," Caleb said. They sat with the filing spread on the table between them. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray and cold, the promised rain finally arriving in the form of a thin drizzle that made the paddock fence look darker, and the grass look greener, and everything looked slightly more serious than it had an hour ago. "The Fulton affidavit is the problem," Eleanor said. "Everything else we can argue around, but if the bank manager swears that Thomas appeared competent—" "He would swear that," Pritchard said. "He was in the room. He's been in that room for every transaction Crow's bank has made. He knows what he's supposed to have seen." "Then we need something that contradicts Fulton," Eleanor said. "Something that puts the lie to what he claims he observed." The table was quiet. The rain ticked against the window. It was Clara who gave them the answer, and she did it without knowing she was doing it. She had come in from outside, damp from the drizzle, hanging her coat on the hook by the door, and she said without looking at anyone in particular, the way she delivered observations that she considered obvious, "Chester's been off his water again, like last January when it was too cold. He does the same thing every time, and you can always tell because his eyes go glassy before he starts stumbling." Eleanor looked at her daughter. "Glassy eyes before stumbling," she said slowly. Clara looked at her. "Like Thomas used to get when he had the fever?" The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Pritchard. "The October fever," she said. "Hale documented it on the 14th. The signing was the 19th. But the fever—" She stopped. She was working it out. "The fever broke. Hale documented the acute phase on the 14th. But what Hale described as mental clouding, how long does that persist after the fever breaks?" Pritchard looked at Caleb. Caleb was already standing up. "Hale," he said, "we need to ask Hale specifically, not just that Thomas was examined on the 14th, but what the documented recovery timeline was. If the mental clouding persists for days after acute fever breaks, then Thomas could have appeared physically improved by the 19th, Eleanor said, while still being cognitively impaired. And Fulton, who is not a medical professional, would have had no way to know the difference. Unless he did know, Caleb said. Unless Crow knew and Fulton knew, and the 19th was chosen deliberately because it was late enough for Thomas to appear recovered, but early enough for the impairment to still be present. The room held that for a moment. "That changes the affidavit," Pritchard said carefully. "It doesn't disprove what Fulton claims he saw, but it provides a medical framework that explains why what Fulton saw was not what it appeared to be." He was already reaching for his pen. I need to talk to Hale today. I'll go with you, Eleanor said. I'll stay here, Caleb said. I need to write to Harlan County. There are people there who aren't in Crow's attorney's statement. People who knew what I was doing and why. I should have reached out to them already. He said the last part evenly, without self-flagellation, but Eleanor heard the edge in it. The specific accountability of a man who has learned to track his own delays. She looked at him. You're reaching out now. Yes. Then that's what matters. She got her coat. Pritchard was already gathering his case. At the door, she paused. Caleb, she said. He looked up from this paper he'd already started writing on. Whatever happened in Harlan County, whatever mistake you made, you've been carrying it like it's the whole of you, she said. It's not. People can see that it's not. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between acknowledgement and resistance, the look of someone who receives a thing carefully because they're not sure yet whether they've earned it. Go talk to Hale, he said. She went. Hale's recovery timeline documentation proved to be exactly what they needed. His ledger entry from the 14th described acute fever with mental clouding. His follow-up entry from the 17th, 3 days before the signing, described the fever as broken, but the patient as exhibiting residual confusion and difficulty maintaining sequential thought, which I advised would resolve over a further period of rest and limited exertion. Rest and limited exertion. Not signing contracts, not making financial decisions of consequence. Pritchard spent 2 hours with Hale going through the entries. Eleanor sat in the corner of the examination room and listened and did not interrupt, because Pritchard was doing his work and she had learned over the past 2 weeks to recognize when other people were doing their work well and to stay out of it. When they were done, Pritchard had 3 pages of notes, and Hale had agreed to a formal sworn deposition that afternoon. Walking back to Pritchard's office through the thin rain, Eleanor thought about Fulton, the bank manager, the man in the room who had handed Thomas a pen and watched him sign, and had now sworn that Thomas had appeared competent. She tried to imagine it. Thomas on the 19th, 5 days out of the worst of the fever, probably upright, probably talking, probably seeming to most people like a man who was recovered. But inside, the sequential thought still disrupted, the judgment still running at partial capacity, trusting the man across the desk the way you trust people when your defenses are down and you don't know they're down. She felt the anger of it freshly, which surprised her. She'd thought she'd arrived at some settled place with the anger, some organized version of it. But standing in the cold rain on the main street of Red Hollow, it came back without warning. Not the hot kind, but the cold and specific kind, the kind that knows exactly what it's angry at and why. She let it be there. She didn't try to put it back. The hearing date came through 10 days later. District Court, Judge Emmett Carver presiding. Not Hooper, a judge from outside the county, assigned precisely because of the jurisdictional questions Pritchard had raised in the injunction filing. The date was 3 weeks out. Webb was still in the area, staying at the same boarding house Caleb had left when Crow's story about him started circulating. He came out to the ranch the evening the hearing date arrived and sat with Eleanor and Caleb and went through the structure of what the hearing would look like, who would speak, and in what order, and what Crow's attorney would try to do with each piece of it. Cole will go after the survey evidence first, Webb said. That's the structural foundation of your case, so he'll want to weaken it before anything else. He'll argue clerical error, licensing irregularities, anything that introduces doubt about the Meridian connection. Pritchard has the 6 properties cross-referenced, Caleb said. Same firm, same dates, same outcomes. Cole will say coincidence, Webb said, or legitimate business pattern. It's not nothing. A good judge will see through it, but it takes a good judge. Carver? Eleanor asked. Webb considered. Carver is honest, he said. That's not nothing in this region. He's also slow to reach conclusions, which is either a virtue or a liability depending on what side you're on. We want him slow, Pritchard said. He'd arrived an hour after Webb. We want him to sit with the evidence. The faster he moves, the more advantage Cole has. Cole will be quicker on his feet in the room. They talked for 2 more hours. The rain had stopped by then, and the evening was clear and cold. and at some point Clara had fallen asleep on the bench by the wall and no one had moved her, and the adults had instinctively kept their voices at a level that wouldn't wake her. When Webb and Pritchard left, Caleb carried Clara to her room without waking her, because she was 8 and still light enough to carry, which was the kind of thing you did without thinking about it when a child was asleep in the wrong place. Eleanor watched from the doorway of the small room and then stepped back to let him set her down, and Clara made a small sound and turned on her side and didn't wake. They stood in the hallway. "She's going to be fine," Caleb said. It wasn't a reassurance exactly. He'd stopped doing that weeks ago. It was more like something he was thinking out loud. "She's been fine," Eleanor said. "She's been fine through all of it." "She gets that from somewhere," he said. Eleanor looked at the closed door of Clara's room. She thought about what it meant to get something from somewhere. The inheritance of quality, the way it passed through families not always by instruction, but by proximity, by watching, by the slow absorption of how someone moved through the world. She thought about what Clara was absorbing now. The past 2 weeks, the papers on the table, the visitors at the door, the conversations kept just below a child's sleeping threshold, the picture of 2 people not giving up. She hoped it was enough. She hoped the picture was good enough to be worth inheriting. "Get some sleep," she said. "The next 3 weeks are going to be long." Caleb went back toward the barn. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment longer, listening to the house settle around her. The tick of the clock running 3 minutes fast, the creak of the east wall in the night wind, the ordinary sounds of a place that was still hers. Still hers. She went to bed, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't lie awake calculating. She was still afraid. That hadn't changed, and she didn't expect it to. But fear and forward motion, she had learned, were not mutually exclusive. They could occupy the same body at the same time, and sometimes the fear was what kept you honest about the stakes, and the forward motion was what kept the fear from making decisions on your behalf. 3 weeks, she thought. Then she stopped thinking and slept. The morning of the hearing, Eleanor woke before the clock. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. The east wall was quiet. The night wind had died sometime before dawn. The clock on the shelf read 4:54, which meant 4:51 by accurate time, and the sky outside the window was the particular shade of black that comes just before it starts becoming something else. She got up. She dressed in the dark, not because she had to, but because she'd been dressing in the dark for 14 months, and her hands knew where everything was without needing to see it. She put on the gray dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, which was the best dress she owned, and which she'd worn twice since then. Once to a neighbor's wedding she'd almost not gone to. Once to a meeting with the county assessor that had come to nothing. She smoothed it with her hands. It still fit, though the waist was looser than it had been. 14 months of managed meals. She put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the sky begin to change. Caleb was already in the paddock when the light came up enough to see him. He was brushing down both horses with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything he did with his hands, working from neck to flank in long, even strokes. He'd put on his good shirt. She could see that even from the window, the darker fabric, the collar that sat differently than his work clothes. He'd combed his hair, which made him look slightly less like himself, more like a version of himself that was making an effort. She thought about how strange it was that a person could become familiar to you in 3 weeks. Not known. She didn't know Caleb Mercer, not the way you know people you've spent years alongside, but familiar. The pace of him, the particular quality of his attention, the way he did not say things that didn't need to be said, and said clearly the things that did. She had built a working picture of him in 3 weeks, the way you build a working picture of terrain. Not every detail, but enough to navigate. She thought about Thomas. She'd been doing that less. And when she did, it was different now. Less like loss and more like reference. Like consulting something she carried with her rather than reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. She didn't know if that was healing or just distance. Maybe they were the same thing, moving slowly in the same direction. Clara appeared at the kitchen door in her nightgown. "Is today the day?" she asked. "Today's the day," Eleanor said. Clara came to stand beside her at the window. They watched Caleb work for a moment. "Are you scared?" Clara asked. Eleanor thought about the honest answer. "Some," she said. "Me too," Clara said, which surprised Eleanor because Clara had seemed throughout all of this to exist in a state of practical acceptance that Eleanor had both admired and worried about. I keep thinking about what happens if it doesn't work. I know, Eleanor said. What do we do if it doesn't work? Eleanor put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Clara was getting taller, had been getting taller all summer, and Eleanor kept being surprised by it, kept reaching for the child height and finding slightly more of her than expected. We figure that out if it comes to it, Eleanor said. But we don't do it before it comes to it. That's just carrying weight you haven't been given yet. Clara leaned against her. That sounds like something you made up just now. I've been making things up as I go for 14 months, Eleanor said. Some of it sticks. No. They arrived in Red Hollow at 8 in the morning. The hearing was at 10 in the town hall, which was the largest indoor space in Red Hollow, and which smelled of old wood and winter and the particular staleness of a room that was opened for occasions rather than used regularly. Pritchard was already there when they arrived, arranging papers on the plaintiff's table with the organized urgency of a man who has prepared thoroughly and is now rechecking the preparation because that is what thorough men do. He looked up when Eleanor came in and gave her a nod that conveyed several things at once: readiness, controlled nerves, something that might have been determination if you looked at it from the right angle. Nora Delaney was already seated in the gallery. She had dressed in black, which Eleanor thought was either mourning or formality, and her leather folder was on her lap, and her back was straight in the particular way of someone who has decided something and is holding the decision in their spine. She looked at Eleanor when Eleanor came in. She nodded once. Eleanor nodded back. Dr. Hale arrived at 8:30. He sat beside Nora in the gallery, which surprised Eleanor. She wouldn't have predicted those two would sit together. But Hale had set his hat on the bench beside him and was speaking quietly to Nora, and Nora was listening with the closest thing to softness Eleanor had seen from her. And there was something in the exchange that felt like people who have each been waiting a long time to be in the same room, finally being in it. Webb was in the back of the room, against the wall, in civilian clothes. He told Eleanor he would observe rather than participate unless called upon. He looked like a man watching a card game he already knew the probable outcome of, but was too professional to predict out loud. Crow came in at 9:45. He came in the same way he'd come into her kitchen 6 weeks ago, without particular hurry, without the quality of a man who needed the room to notice him, because he'd long since moved past needing things from rooms. His attorney, Bertram Cole, walked beside him, a man in his 40s, compact, with quick eyes that moved across the space cataloging everything, and Eleanor understood immediately what Pritchard had meant about his competence. Cole looked at every person in the room, and she had the sense that he retained all of it. Crow looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then moved his eyes to Caleb, then away, dismissive in the specific way of a man who has already decided what something is worth and isn't going to keep counting. She watched Caleb watch Crow. There was nothing dramatic in Caleb's face. No heat, no visible settling of old scores. Just the same attention he brought to everything, steady and present and noting what was there. Judge Emmett Carver arrived at 10 o'clock and not a minute before or after, which Eleanor decided to take as a good sign about the man's relationship with his own word. He was perhaps 60, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had spent significant portions of his life outdoors before spending the rest of it in courtrooms, and who had not entirely lost the outdoor person in the transition. He settled at the bench, reviewed his papers for 30 seconds without speaking, then looked up at the room. "We're here on the matter of Voss versus Red Hollow Savings and Lending," he said. "Specifically on the question of whether the transfer of title on the Voss property, deferred by injunction, should be permanently voided on grounds of fraud in the origination of the underlying loan instrument. I've reviewed the injunction filing and the counterfiling. I'll hear from both sides. Mr. Pritchard, you'll go first." Pritchard stood. What happened over the next 3 hours was not dramatic in the way Eleanor had half expected. No single devastating revelation, no moment where the room gasped and Crow's face collapsed. It was more like watching water work on stone, slow, steady, and more powerful than it looked. Pritchard laid the survey evidence first. He walked Carver through the timeline with the patience of a man who understood that a judge who reached his own conclusions, was more persuaded than a judge who was pushed to them. The 6 properties. The Meridian land and assessment filings. The dates, always before default, always without the property owner's knowledge or commission. Cole objected twice on relevance grounds. Carver overruled both times, which told Eleanor something. Then Pritchard called Hale. Hale took the stand with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided to be honest and is not going to let nerves make him sloppy about it. He read from his ledger in his own words. The October 14th examination, the fever, the documented mental clouding, the follow-up entry on the 17th, the language about residual confusion and sequential thought. He answered Pritchard's questions about the recovery timeline with clinical precision. Post-febrile cognitive impairment could persist for 7 to 10 days in cases of this severity. The contract had been signed on the 19th, 5 days after the acute phase, 2 days after the follow-up noting continued impairment. Cole cross-examined him for 40 minutes. He was good at it. He pushed at the language in the ledger, at the difference between documented clinical observation and formal medical certification, at whether Hale had advised Thomas Voss against signing any documents. Hale held. He answered what was asked and didn't offer more than what was asked, and Eleanor watched him and thought about the man who had sat across from her in his office, and said too long, perhaps, and she felt something for him that was not quite gratitude, but was adjacent to it. The Fulton affidavit came in through Cole. The bank manager's sworn statement that Thomas had appeared competent and willing at the signing. Pritchard didn't attack it directly. He simply placed it alongside Hale's timeline and let Carver sit with the distance between what Fulton had observed and what the medical record documented, and let the judge's own intelligence do the work. Then Pritchard called Nora Delaney. She walked to the stand with her leather folder and she sat in the chair, and she looked at Judge Carver with the directness of someone who has been waiting 2 years for a room like this one and is not going to waste it by being tentative. She presented her letters. All of them. Dates, recipients, certified mail records. 2 years of documented attempts to report what had happened to her property, all met with official silence. She named the officials she'd written to. She named their positions. She named the dates of the certified deliveries. Then she said, in the same flat-carrying voice she'd used with Eleanor in the room with the geranium, I was not confused about what I saw. I was not mistaken about the survey date or who filed it. I was not hysterical or vindictive. I had documentation, and I sent it to the people whose job it was to act on it, and none of them did. I would like to know why. The room was quiet after she finished. Cole's cross-examination of Nora lasted 12 minutes. He didn't get much. Nora Delaney on a witness stand turned out to be one of those witnesses who are essentially impervious to reframing because they stick to documented fact and decline to speculate. And speculation was what Cole needed to create doubt. Crow's turn came after the midday recess. Cole put him on the stand himself, which was either confidence or necessity, and walked him through the origination of the loan in measured professional terms. The financial need, the terms offered, the standard survey process, the arm's-length transaction. Crow was good on the stand. Eleanor had expected that. He was composed and specific, and he answered every question without the quality of a man hiding anything, which was either because he wasn't hiding anything or because he'd been hiding things for so long he'd forgotten there was another way to sound. Pritchard cross-examined him for an hour. He didn't go after Crow on the big things first. He started small. The specific date Meridian had been commissioned for the Voss survey, who at the bank had authorized it, whether that was standard practice for loans of this type. Crow answered with smooth confidence. Then Pritchard asked him the same questions about the second property from the Meridian list. Then the third. With each iteration, the same survey company, the same pre-default timing, the same absence of owner commission. And with each iteration, Crow's answers became slightly more about general practice and slightly less about specific memory. And Carver was watching, and Webb in the back of the room was watching, and Eleanor was watching. On the fifth property, Pritchard asked Crow directly, were you aware, at the time Meridian Land and Assessment filed their resurvey of the Hargrove property in June of 1881, that the Hargrove loan was in arrears? Cole objected. Relevance. Carver looked at Pritchard. The pattern across multiple properties is the evidence of intent, Pritchard said. A single survey discrepancy is an error. 6 survey discrepancies, all pre-default, all filed by the same company without owner commission, constitute a practice. The court cannot evaluate intent without seeing the pattern. Carver thought for 4 seconds. Eleanor counted them. Overruled, he said. The witness will answer. Crow looked at Cole. Cole gave him nothing. No signal, no direction, because there was nothing useful to signal. Crow said he didn't recall the specific timing of the Hargrove survey relative to the loan status. It was not a confession. It was not an admission. But it was the first time in 3 hours that Silas Crow had said he didn't recall something, and the room felt the difference between a man who knows everything about his business and a man who has just decided he doesn't remember something specific, and those are not the same thing, and everyone present understood that. Carver recessed for 30 minutes to review his notes. Eleanor sat with Pritchard and Caleb at the plaintiff's table and didn't say much. Caleb had his hands folded on the table and was looking at them. Pritchard was reviewing his papers. Eleanor looked at the room, at Nora in the gallery, who had not moved from her chair, who was sitting with the same straight back and the folder on her lap. At Hale, who was rubbing the bridge of his nose beneath his spectacles. At Webb against the back wall, still as furniture, unreadable. She looked at Clara, who had been sitting in the second row of the gallery since the start, and had not fidgeted once, which was either maturity or the particular stillness of a child who understands that the adults around her are managing something fragile, and that movement might disturb it. Clara met her eyes and gave her the small nod of someone who has been paying close attention and has reached a conclusion she isn't ready to say out loud yet. Eleanor nodded back. Carver returned at 2:15. He sat at the bench and arranged his papers and looked out at the room for a moment before he spoke. I've reviewed the evidence presented this morning, he said. I want to be clear about what I'm ruling on and what I'm not. This hearing addresses the specific question of whether the Voss loan instrument is enforceable as written, and whether the transfer of title should be permanently voided. I am not, at this stage, ruling on the broader pattern of business practices raised by the plaintiff, as that is a matter for further proceeding. What I am ruling on is the specific case before me. A pause. Cole had his pen ready. Pritchard had both hands flat on the table. The survey discrepancy between the original deed, the contract instrument, and the county record constitutes a material irregularity that was not disclosed to the borrower at the time of signing. That alone warrants further scrutiny. However, the more significant finding is this. The medical record submitted by Dr. Hale, taken in conjunction with the signing date, establishes a credible medical basis for questioning whether Thomas Voss had the cognitive capacity to enter a binding legal contract on October the 19th, 1882. The affidavit of the bank manager, Fulton, does not address this question because Fulton is not a medical professional and his observation of apparent competence does not override documented medical evidence of impairment. Carver looked at his papers, then back up. The court finds that the loan instrument as executed cannot be considered fully enforceable given the circumstances of its signing. The transfer of title is permanently voided. The underlying debt question is remanded to further proceeding to determine what, if any, valid obligation exists under a properly constructed instrument. The Voss property remains in the name of Eleanor Ruth Voss pending those proceedings. Court is adjourned. He closed his folder and stood up. The room didn't explode. It did something quieter and more complicated than that. It exhaled collectively, like something that had been held had finally been let go. Pritchard sat very still for a moment, then began writing. Caleb put both hands on the table and looked at them. Nora Delaney stood up from her chair in the gallery and pressed her folder against her chest and looked at the ceiling, not crying, just looking at something that wasn't in the room. Eleanor sat. She sat, and she let the words settle into her the way water settles into dry ground, slowly, finding the spaces, not all at once. The Voss property remains in the name of Eleanor Ruth Voss. She said it in her head in her own voice, then said it again. Clara appeared at her elbow, having come through the gallery rail without Eleanor noticing. Is it over? Clara asked. Did we? The ranch is ours, Eleanor said. Clara sat down in the chair beside her and leaned against her shoulder and said nothing, which was the right thing. Crow left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Cole packed his papers with the efficient lack of expression of a professional who has lost cases before and will again, and followed. Eleanor watched them go and felt, not triumph, which she'd half expected, but something quieter. Something like the absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as weight. Webb caught Caleb in the doorway on the way out. Eleanor was close enough to hear them. "I'll file the federal case by end of month," Webb said. "The pattern evidence from today's hearing gives me what I needed. The other 5 properties, it'll take time, but we have grounds now." "Will it hold?" Caleb asked. "It'll hold if the evidence holds," Webb said, which was Webb's version of a promise. "Tell Mrs. Voss I'll be in touch." He left. Caleb came back to Eleanor. "The federal case is moving," he said. "I heard," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. There was something between them that didn't need to be named, that existed in the space of the past 3 weeks, and everything that had happened in them. The table, and the coffee, and the papers, and the fence posts, and the cedar box, and the letters sent before dawn, and the 2 hours of silence in a kitchen that had somehow not been uncomfortable. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. It was a genuine question. He looked at the floor for a moment. It was one of the few times she'd seen him look anywhere but straight at the thing in front of him. "I thought I'd stay through winter," he said. If there's work enough." "There's always work enough on a ranch," she said. "Then I'll stay through winter," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was one practical person telling another practical person a fact about the near future. And in that way it was more honest than most things people said to each other when they were feeling something they didn't have language for yet. "The east fence still needs 2 new posts," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it." Chut. The weeks after the hearing moved differently than the weeks before it. Not easier exactly. The ranch was still a ranch. The work was still the work. The cattle still needed water, and the fence still needed watching, and winter was coming with the particular indifference of seasons to human legal proceedings. But the weight had shifted. The quality of the days was different when the thing you were working toward was continuance rather than survival. Nora Delaney's situation changed slowly and then more quickly. Webb's federal investigation, once it opened formally, created a context in which Crow's remaining leverage over the town began to dissolve. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the way that authority built on fear dissolves when people stop being afraid of it, which is to say, person by person, decision by decision, each one making the next one slightly easier. Will Hargrove came to Eleanor in December, 2 months after the hearing. He stood at her door with his hat in his hands. He'd come out from town on his day off from the mill, and he said he was sorry he hadn't been able to put his name on the statement. He said it plainly, without excuses, the way people apologize when they're more interested in the apology being accurate than in it being comfortable. Eleanor told him she understood why he'd made the choice he'd made. "I don't think I would have made a different choice," she said, "if Clara had been depending on my position at the mill." "Maybe not," he said, "but I've been thinking about it since." "That's something," she said. He left. She thought about him on the walk back from the door, about the particular weight of watching someone else fight a battle you couldn't join and then carrying that afterward. She thought there was probably more of that in the world than people talked about. The people who knew something was wrong and couldn't move against it. Not because they didn't care, but because the stakes for them were different. The math didn't work out the same way. She wasn't sure she had the right to judge that arithmetic in other people when she'd barely survived it herself. Crow left Red Hollow in February. He didn't announce it. He closed the bank. The accounts were transferred to an institution in the county seat, and he left. His house sat empty for 3 months before someone bought it. The man who bought it was a farmer from Nebraska who knew nothing about Silas Crow and had no reason to care, and he painted the shutters a different color and put in a kitchen garden, and the house became quietly just a house again. Judge Hooper resigned from the bench in March, citing health reasons. Whether his health was actually in question or whether Webb's federal investigation had reached a point that made resignation preferable to whatever was coming, Eleanor never knew for certain, and she didn't spend a great deal of time wondering about it. Some questions answered themselves in the doing and didn't require further explanation. The following summer, Eleanor sat on the porch in the early morning with her coffee, the way she'd started doing once the weight of the previous year had lifted enough to make sitting still feel like something other than wasted time. The east pasture was full. The cattle had come through winter in better shape than she'd dared predict, and spring had been wet enough to fill the well properly, and there was grass in the pasture that had the color and density of land that had been managed well over years. Thomas had built that. She had maintained it. She intended to keep it. Caleb was at the fence line on the north side. She could see him from the porch, though he was too far to make out clearly. He'd stayed through winter as he'd said he would, and then stayed into spring because the spring work was heavy, and now it was summer and he was still there, and neither of them had found occasion to have a formal conversation about it because some things settled themselves by simply continuing. She had thought a lot, over the winter, about what the previous year had meant. Not in the grand sense. She was not much inclined to grand sense-making, never had been. But in the specific practical sense of what it had required and what it had changed. It had required, she thought, more than she'd known she had. It had required a particular kind of stubbornness that was different from Thomas's stubbornness. His had been self-contained, turned inward, running on its own fuel. Hers had turned outward, had needed to reach toward other people and let other people reach toward her, which was something she'd been bad at and had gotten less bad at by necessity. She'd had to learn to ask. She'd had to learn to let Doctor Hell carry some of it, and Pritchard and Nora Delaney with her leather folder and her 2 years of unanswered letters. She'd had to let Caleb stay, which at the time had felt like risk, and in retrospect felt like the most sensible thing she'd done in the whole of it. That was the thing no one told you about being capable. That capability, taken too far, becomes a wall. She'd built a good wall. She'd needed it. But a wall that nothing can get through in either direction eventually stops being protection and starts being just enclosure. Clara came out of the house with her own cup of something, not coffee, some herb mixture she'd taken to making that smelled like the meadow, and sat on the step below Eleanor's chair. Chester ate his full ration this morning, she said. Both portions. That's good, Eleanor said. Chester was 20 now, and some mornings he ate and some mornings he didn't, and Clara tracked it with the conscientious attention of someone who understands that a thing being temporary doesn't mean it stops mattering. Caleb fixed the north gate, Clara said, the one that's been dragging since March. I know. I asked him to. When? Yesterday. Clara considered this. You're getting better at asking, she said. Eleanor looked at her daughter, who was 9 years old and had spent the past year watching 2 adults navigate a crisis and had apparently been taking notes. I'm working on it, Eleanor said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and looked out at the pasture. She drank whatever was in her cup. She had Thomas's coloring and Eleanor's way of sitting, upright, contained, not quite at rest. And she had something that was entirely her own, some quality that hadn't come from either of them, something that was just Clara, which was the most interesting thing about her. Eleanor thought about what Clara would carry forward from this year. Not the crisis. The crisis would fade into family history, into the kind of story that gets compressed over generations into a few essential facts. What she'd carry was the other thing, the texture of it, what it looked like when people refused to be finished, when they found each other across the distance of fear and mutual suspicion and worked towards something together without any certainty it would work. That was the thing worth carrying. Eleanor hoped she'd carry it. She thought about Nora Delaney, who was no longer living above the dry goods store. Webb's federal case had included a restitution component that was still working its way through the courts, slow and uncertain, but moving. Nora had found a small place to rent on the east side of town and had put a geranium in every window, which Eleanor found out about from 3 separate people who mentioned it independently, as though the geraniums were a fact about the town now. She thought about Pritchard, who had won his first major case in this county in 20 years of practice, and who had seemed, since the hearing, to stand differently when he walked down the main street. Not taller exactly, but more present, less apologetic about taking up space. She thought about Thomas signing his name in someone else's hand, feverish and trusting and not knowing what he was walking them into. She'd made peace with that, or something close enough to peace that she'd stopped distinguishing between the two. He had not been a man built for suspicion. That was a failing, and also, in other lights, something close to a quality. She hoped Clara had inherited something of it. the willingness to trust without the innocence that made trust into vulnerability. Caleb came up from the fence line at mid-morning, the way he always did, covered in work, not hurrying, checking things as he passed. He stopped at the paddock to look at Chester, who was standing in the shade with his ears forward, which Clara had taught him to read as a good sign. He came to the porch. He looked at the two of them, Eleanor in the chair, Clara on the step, and there was something in his face that she'd learned to recognize over the months. The look of a man who had been rootless a long time and was encountering carefully and without making too much of it something that felt like the opposite of that. "North Gate's done," he said. "Thank you," Eleanor said. He went inside to wash up. Clara watched him go. "He's staying," Clara said. It was not a question. "Seems that way," Eleanor said. Clara nodded. She looked out at the pasture, at the cattle, at the land that ran out to the tree line, and then beyond it to the hills that had always been there and would keep on being there, regardless of what anyone tried to do with the paper that described who owned which portion of them. "Good," she said. Eleanor drank her coffee. The morning moved around them the way mornings do when there is nothing chasing them. Slowly, with the light spreading across the grass in the way it only does after enough rain, and the windmill turning in a breeze too gentle to feel on your skin, but strong enough to move things. There is a thing that happens to people who survive a hard year intact. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but intact. The world looks the same and isn't. The same fence, the same cattle, the same clock running 3 minutes fast on the shelf. But something in the relationship to all of it has shifted, the way a bone heals stronger at the break, if it's given time. Eleanor had not come through this year because she was stronger than Silas Crow, or smarter, or better positioned. She'd come through it because she had stayed in motion when stopping would have been easier, and because she had let people help her when every instinct said to manage it alone, and because the people she'd let in had turned out to be carrying their own reasons to stand firm, their own accumulated refusals to be finished. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Not the legal strategy or the federal investigation or the survey evidence or Hale's ledger or Nora's letters. Those were instruments. The thing underneath them, the thing that made the instruments available, was people who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that fear was not going to make their decisions for them this time. She would carry that. She thought Clara would carry it too. She thought, in her more honest moments, that it was what Thomas had been trying to build all along. Not just a ranch, not just 412 acres of frontier ground, but the kind of life that could withstand the weight of being lived in fully by imperfect people who kept showing up anyway. The coffee was gone. The morning had moved into mid-morning, and the cattle were drifting toward the water trough, and there was work to do. Eleanor set her cup down and stood up. She went inside to start on it.